professor of Russian language. His name was Goldman, and he fought in the Red Army during World War II. He had lived through the Great Terror in the Soviet Union before the war, and he escaped the United States after the war, bringing his expertise and experience with him. How lucky, I think, our students in our community was to have him here. Shortly thereafter, our founding department chair in the history department, we've only had 2 department chairs in the history department since the university was founded. Our founding chair brought Larry Holmes to teach Russian and Soviet history here in 1968. So Russian history has been with us nearly as long as university as well. And after Goldman retired, Joe Mosher took his place. Dr. Mosher is retiring this year, and we are ever so sad to see him go. Through these people, we have been so fortunate to have 50 years of producing top-notch scholars and students in Russian language and Russian history at the University of South Alabama. These students have gone on to brilliant careers, many of them in Washington, D.C. And I would like to emphasize that their success is your success, as every successful student adds value to your degree. And moreover, Russian language students who make it to Washington, D.C. are representing the interests of Alabama in the world. So we are off to good things. Our university founders believed that our university, our students, you, have a role to play on the national level and in the world. Our faculty and our administration has fought all these 50 years for the rights of Alabamans to have a good education. The Russian language program, thanks to the perseverance of faculty and administration, I bet you would be surprised to know, as I was, is the only foreign language program between FSU and LSU. And from here to Mobile, we are Mobile. From here to Huntsville. Our founders believe that studying the world is not only a right, but a responsibility. And I like to say it is also patriotic, as knowledge of language, and in this case Russian, is key to representing the United States in a competitive world and key to U.S. security interests. So to students and anyone who feels the inspiration, take a Russian language class or a history class. You may find your calling in this great tradition of our university. So one more paragraph about Russian studies, and then we will move on to introducing Professor Goldman. Our founders' vision about the importance of Russian history has proven enduring. As Russia today, if you watch the news, you will know, is reviving its earlier status as a great power. Today, Russia has a monopoly over energy in Europe. Its technology sector is thriving, and it continues to lead the space race with its new space tourism programs. And for enough rubles, you too can fly to the moon. So start saving those rubles. Russia has one of the biggest economies in the world and is still growing. Russia has recently established the Eurasian Economic Union, meant to be a counterpoint to the European Union. And the borders, interestingly enough, will fall roughly along the same lines as that of the Soviet Union. Putin's Russia is slowly and surely returning to an authoritarian regime. And finally, I never forget this. I'm not sure if we all keep it in our minds or not, but I always keep it central in my mind, that Russia still has, along with the United States, the biggest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world. The study of Russian language is more important than ever, and we will do well to perpetuate the vision of our university founders. And so, now let me speak more directly about Professor Goldman. Professor Goldman is of the first generation of scholars to work in Russian archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Previously, the Soviet regime restricted access to scholars wishing to study Russian and Soviet history. And much of what we knew about the Soviet Union was either shrouded in mystery or it was inflected with Cold War propaganda. Historians like Professor Goldman have labored at uncovering the truth behind the Iron Curtain to learn more about the reality of life as it was lived by Soviet citizens. In addition to numerous articles and edited volumes, Professor Goldman has published 4 books with Cambridge University Press. She is an expert, one of the nation's leading experts in Stalinism. Her first books, Women, the State and Revolution and Women at the Gates, trace Soviet efforts to bring equality to all of these sexes, to the sexes, to all of them. She showed how optimistic Russian revolutionaries aimed to alleviate women's double burden of labor in the workforce and in the home, how they tried to care for children orphaned by 7 years of war from 1914 to 1921, to promote marriages and free unions based upon love rather than economic necessity. She then shows how the Soviet dreams for improving society founded upon Stalin's accession to power. By the time Stalin consolidated his position in the early 1930s, the communist experiment was over. Subsequently, her work in 2 books, Inventing the Enemy, Denunciation and Terror in Stalin's Russia, and Terror and Democracy in the Age of Stalin, The Social Dynamics of Repression, has explored the interior of the Stalinist state and the Great Terror, in which the NKVD, or we can perhaps describe it as the cursor of the KGB, arrested more than 2.5 million Soviet citizens as enemy of the state. In particular, Goldman shows that Stalin did not execute the Great Terror alone, nor was the Communist Party singularly responsible. Instead, millions of Soviet citizens turned on co-workers, neighbors, friends, and lovers. Citizens accused people they had known intimately and for years of being enemies of the state. Victims of the terror became perpetrators, and perpetrators became victims. Why did the Soviet Union, Soviet citizens turn each other into the state? And why did Soviet society, in essence, cannibalize itself? You will have to read her books to find the answers to these questions. And after the event, Professor Goldman will be on hand to sign 2 of her works. Currently, and I do hope you have a look at them, they are superbly written, beautifully written. Those books pull the reader right through page after page. Her latest work, focusing on the Soviet home front during the Second World War, which is the subject of tonight's lecture. So please, let us give Professor Goldman a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mara, for that introduction, and also thank you all for inviting me. Tonight I'm going to talk about life on the home front, the Soviet experience in World War II. And I actually want to start out with a personal experience. I first visited Russia in 1984 when it was still the Soviet Union. And I had the opportunity at that time to live in a socialist country for a year. I was living in a dormitory at Moscow State University with other students from all over the world. Times were very different then. Tourists visited Russia, but they did so on organized tours. There were almost no Westerners visiting on their own or living in the country for any period of time. So the only exceptions in those years were students on official exchanges, of which I was one, journalists, diplomats, and embassy personnel. There were so few Americans in the Soviet Union at that time that we did our laundry in the American embassy. Now, you can appreciate this if you go visit France today, for example, and you show up at the American Embassy with your laundry, they will probably take you away as a lunatic. So this was just an example of how very few Westerners there were in the country. It was a very unusual experience to live, to shop, to study, to make friends, to socialize freely in a country that was virtually closed to the West. This was also the period of the Cold War. There was enormous mistrust between the United States and the Soviet Union. Lack of knowledge, propaganda and lies on both sides. We were in the midst of a nuclear arms race costing billions of dollars, which actually hurt the domestic prospects of both countries. And very few Soviet citizens had ever met an American. Very few Americans had ever met someone from the Soviet Union. One afternoon, my husband and I were wandering around in a neighborhood, and we got lost. And we stopped someone on the street to ask for directions. He was an older man, and when he realized that we were Americans, he was extremely surprised. And he talked to us for a little while, and he told me that he was a veteran of the Second World War. And then he came very close to me, and he took my shoulders in both his hands, and he looked me deep in the eyes, and he said to me with great emotion, "There must never be another war. You don't know war. There must never be another." Now, at the time, I was in my 20s at that time, and I was just sort of shocked by the intensity of his emotion. I didn't quite understand what he was saying. I was silly and embarrassed, and I sort of stepped away from him. But that incident really stayed with me, and it stayed with me for many, many years. And it was only after I traveled to Russia many times did I begin to understand the wealth and the depth of the experience that he brought to that encounter. As a result of the Cold War, we as Americans are taught very little about the role of the Soviet Union in World War II, despite the fact that the Soviet Union was our ally. Yet it is simply impossible to understand the war without understanding the role of the Soviet Union. There is this blank space in our education, and while it's not an outright lie, it's an omission that is so profound that it makes our teaching of the war to a certain extent a lie. Most of the war against Germany was fought on the Eastern Front by the Red Army. Great Britain and the United States did not open a second front in Europe until 1944. That was already very late in the war. Without the Soviet Union and the enormous sacrifices on the Eastern Front, the outcome of the war might have been very different. And I think we can get some sense of this just by taking a look at the losses in the war. So, for example, does anybody know how many people the United States lost in the war? No? It was 325,000. Britain, 445,000. Japan, 1,174,000. Germany, 2,225,000. The Soviet Union lost between 27 and 30 million people. That was 15% of the 1940 population. An entire generation of young men was destroyed. We could ask the young men now in this room to stand up and walk out of the room and never come back. And that's what it was like then for the people after the war. The men didn't come back. There was no one to marry. It was a society of women. And many of the men that did come back were maimed. They were internally destroyed. So the mark of this war was really very heavy. In 1949, there were 20 million more women than men, mostly in that age group over 25. And I ask you to just think a little bit. That kind of a gender imbalance, what does it mean for people's futures? A large part of the Soviet Union was occupied by the Nazis. We fought the war, but we were never occupied. German troops actually occupied Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltic republics, the Crimea, the Caucasus, and large areas of Russia. This was a territory with a pre-war population of 90 million people, 45% of the Soviet population. So an enormous amount of territory and people lived under Nazi occupation. And much of the Soviet Union was destroyed. Germans destroyed almost 2,000 towns, 70,000 villages razed to the ground, torched, peasants thrown out to wander with their children, no place to live in the middle of the winter. Its industry was destroyed. The area that was occupied was an area that was heavily industrialized. 32,000 industrial enterprises were destroyed. Of the 3 million Jews that were living on Soviet territory, 2 million were murdered by the Nazis. So we learn about the Holocaust and we know that figure of 6 million, but what we don't learn is that 2 of that 6 million were murdered on Soviet soil. So the war marked the Soviet Union in terrible, terrible ways. And yet, because of the Cold War, I think that there's been a blackout on information about the Soviet Union and also about its role as our ally in the fight against fascism. Once the Cold War began, we actually entered a period of unprecedented prosperity. This was the heyday, in a way, of the American economy. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, in this same period of time, experienced a terrible famine in 1946 and also experienced a terrible period in which it was necessary to begin to rebuild the country. The Soviet Union hid its losses, in part out of fear of US attack, and in part it concealed the losses even from its own people. The losses were very, very great. And finally, the Soviet archives were closed up until the early 1990s. So the archives, which contain a wealth of state documents and material, were closed to researchers from the West and even to Soviet researchers to a less extent. As a result, it's only now that we're able to get into the archives. They are now open, to be able to research freely and to be able to study this period of the war to fully understand what happened in the Soviet Union. So I think now it's finally possible to do some serious research based on documents and to begin to answer some questions that we could not answer before. So tonight I want to explore a paradox with you. The Soviet Union experienced terrible food shortages and deep suffering on the home front. Yet, at the same time, the country managed to feed the Red Army, to maintain defense production, and to provision its people. How did the Soviet Union maintain political stability under conditions that created riot, rebellion, and even revolution in other places in the past? So as I'm talking, I want you to think a little bit about that question. And I think in order to begin to explore this issue, we need first to step back and to take a look a little bit at the larger context. Okay, a state's ability to feed the home front is absolutely essential to its ability to wage war, maintain civilian support, and even to retain state power. For those of you who are students of history, you know that there are many examples in the past of states' failures to do this. So, for example, the French Revolution in 1789 was the result in part of a long-simmering financial crisis created at home by France's attempt to wage a number of wars abroad. Food riots in Germany in 1918 helped to bring down the Kaiser and issued in the Weimar Republic. In Russia in 1917, during World War I, it was bread riots that toppled the Tsar and forced his abdication. And again in October, the inability of the government to solve the food crisis at home led the Soviets to take power in 1917. So the relationship between feeding the home front and waging war and maintaining political stability is a very complicated one. German policy. Now the Nazis took the lesson from World War I that an adequate food supply was absolutely critical to maintaining civilian and military morale. And they decided that no matter what happened, the German people would not go hungry during the war. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 was actually closely connected to the issues of food and agriculture. The Soviet Union had a special function in Hitler's vision of a future Germany. Hitler aimed to destroy socialism, to topple the Soviet state, and most importantly, to implant Germany as a colonial power over the colonized East. Hitler saw the Slavic peoples and the Jews as inferior races. He had a profoundly racialized view of the world in which Germans were superior, and then there was a kind of hierarchy of peoples. Some of them deserved to be nothing but slaves, and others deserved to be eliminated entirely. So you have to keep this in your mind. This is a racialized view of the world. In his vision, the Slavs, the Slavic peoples, were basically unable to organize a state. They could not have states of their own. They would have to be dominated and ruled by Germans. The rich agricultural areas of southern Russia and Ukraine would provide for German food needs. The agrarian policies of the Nazis were actually behind some of the worst atrocities of World War II. Herbert Baca, the Reich Minister of Food, produced a document known as the Hunger Plan. This document actually proposed the mass murder of Slavs and Jews. He called them useless eaters. In February of 1941, the Hunger Plan received Hitler's approval, and it became part of Operation Barbarossa, which was the code name for the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Baca argued in the Hunger Plan that the Soviet Union should be transformed into a massive resource base for Germany. In fact, only if the Soviet Union was used as a colonized resource base would Germany have the ability to counter the industrial might of the United States and Great Britain and wage a long war. So the Soviet Union was critical to Hitler's plans. The Hunger Plan spoke euphemistically of, quote, suppressing Russian consumption. Its policy was to stop the flow of food from Ukraine into central and northern Russia. That food would be diverted to feeding the German army and the citizens of the Reich. In other words, German citizens. As a consequence, and this is a direct quote from the Hunger Plan, unbelievable hunger would rule in Russia and its industrial cities, which would die out, so to speak. Umpteenth millions of people will be starved to death. That is a direct quote from the Hunger Plan. The Hunger Plan predicted the murder of about 100 million people. Those who were to implement the plan, and that included the Wehrmacht, the army, the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units, and also German administrators, were basically told that they were to have no sympathy for starving Russians because, quote, the war can only be continued if the entire Wehrmacht is fed from Russian resources in the third year of the war. The siege of Leningrad, you know that Leningrad, the city, was surrounded for 900 days, the longest running siege in modern history. It was surrounded by the German army, and its people were systematically starved. The siege of Leningrad, the deliberate starvation in Kiev and Kharkov and other cities under German occupation were just the first steps in the implementation of Baca's Hunger Plan. So the idea here was that the Slavic subhumans, Untermenschen as they were called, would be eliminated. And Germany would resettle its own people in their place. Existing towns and villages would be leveled to create a blank canvas. Hitler drew overtly on other colonial experiences, and It's horrible to say, but he was fascinated by our own experience with Native Americans. He compared the Slavic peoples to the Native Americans, and he thought Germany will do the same to the Slavic peoples as the American colonists have done to the Native Americans. The Baca Plan went into effect in Leningrad, which was encircled and where close to 1 million people starved to death within the city. Although the city was the first city that did not fall to the Germans, and it never fell to the Germans. It was also partially in effect in other cities under occupation, but it could not be completely enforced. People had ways of getting in and out of the cities, of getting to the countryside, of uniting with relatives, and of bringing food into the cities. So the Germans were never able to enforce it in the occupied towns and cities. One place where they were able to enforce it was among the Soviet POWs, the Soviet prisoners of war. The Germans, in contravention to the Geneva Convention, systematically refused food, shelter, and medical care to all Soviet POWs. Out of 5.7 million Soviet POWs, that's how many prisoners were taken, 3.3 million died in Nazi POW camps. They were starved to death in accordance with the hunger plan. So, in the non-occupied territories, what policies did the Soviet state adopt to ensure that workers received food, that the defense plants could keep running, and that it would be possible to keep the Red Army in the field? Well, first of all, the state almost immediately faced a terrible food crisis. That was connected to the military situation. The first months of the war were a military disaster for the Soviet Union. By December 1941, the Germans had occupied an enormous amount of territory. In the north, Leningrad was surrounded and was being systematically starved to death. In the center, the Germans reached within 25 miles of Moscow, the capital. They could easily see Moscow through a pair of field glasses. And in the south, Kiev had fallen, along with the largest massacre to date of human beings by shootings, which occurred at Baba Yar. In 3 days, 34,000 Jewish women, children, and elderly people were lined up at the lip of a pit and dispatched by machine gun. 90 million people, that's 45% of the pre-war population, was trapped under German occupation, along with 70% of the food stocks in the frontline areas, which were either destroyed or lost during the rapid advance of the Germans. Within the occupied zone, 40% of the cultivated land, 100,000 collective farms, 3,000 tractor stations, and 45% of Soviet livestock. So right from the get-go, the state experiences a terrible food crisis because of the loss of farmland, of animals, and of machinery. What's interesting is that in contrast to the disastrous confusion on the military front, actually, we see a very different approach in terms of food. So the state responds immediately to the food crisis. It cut central stocks to the civilian population, And within 3 weeks of the invasion, it introduced rationing. Now, rationing was very, very important because it meant that if you received a ration card, you would be entitled to food. We often think of rationing as a limiting device, that it might be better to live in a place where there are no rations, so we can just go in and buy whatever we want. But actually, in this context, it's exactly the opposite. People with ration cards ate. People without ration cards, or people who lost their ration cards, had no access to food. So rationing was absolutely critical. Rationing was first introduced in Moscow and Leningrad. Then it spread to the industrial centers. And from there, it spread to all the urban areas. Most people were entitled to a bread ration. That became the staff of life. And defense workers and other people living in the cities, in certain industrial areas, were also entitled to a larger array of foodstuffs. But bread was at the heart of the rationing system. The bakeries and the state were committed to providing freshly baked bread every day. People received a bread ration every day. And in that way, it was different from any other foodstuff. So you might get a monthly allotment of potatoes or a monthly allotment of fish, but bread was something people received every day. Bakery stoppages were regarded as a very serious problem, warranting immediate attention. And bread was also distributed in relatively egalitarian amounts. That meant that although there was some difference in the bread ration that people received, the difference was not very great. Rations were distributed through the Commissariat of Trade. And this was another reason for, I think, the ability of the state to move very quickly. The Commissariat of Trade was immediately converted from a commissariat that dealt with retail trade, in other words, the retail stores, to a commissariat of rationing. It was a pyramid with the top responsible for the entire Soviet Union, and then there were organizations on the republic level. Below that, there were organizations on the province or the state level. And then below that, there were town and local organizations. So the Commissariat of Trade was already in place, and it was quickly converted and placed in charge of rationing. Food was received by the Commissariat of Trade, which then distributed it through its pyramid, which was essentially covering the entire country. The other big advantage that I think the Soviet Union had in dealing with the food crisis was that the state had a lot of experience with a planned economy. In the 1930s, the state had gone through a very rapid period of industrialization. Whole cities had been built from nothing. Steel plants had risen on the steppes. Workers, tens of thousands of young people had been drawn to these sites. And the Soviet Union had experience in feeding large numbers of people in situations where there were not already networks of distribution in place. So planning also helped a great deal here, and we can see the experience of the 1930s with planned industrialization being drawn on during the war to great effect. Rations were basically divided into 5 groups. The highest ration was received by frontline soldiers, then workers, then white-collar workers, then dependents, elderly people, invalids, children living in orphanages, people living in mental institutions being cared for by the state. So that group then came fourth. And then finally, a lower category of rations went to children under 12. So that was sort of the rough allocation there. There were a number of guiding principles behind this system of rationing, but I would say that the hierarchy was in part based on a labor principle. Those who expended the largest number of calories at work in industry received more food, and those who were most valuable to the defense industry also received more food. There was also special feeding for the more vulnerable sections of the population. So, for example, nursing mothers, sick children, workers in hazardous industries, starving workers, workers that had entered a state of starvation. There were special feeding programs for these sectors of the population as well. By early 1942, things had gotten very, very bad on the home front. The German forces had been halted around Leningrad. They had actually been pushed back a little bit from Moscow. This was the first victory against the Germans in the entire war, actually forcing them back a little bit, but they were still rapidly advancing in the south. And what that meant was that a huge new military draft had to be called up, and more soldiers had to be fed. And that meant civilian stocks had to be cut again. Flour was reduced to about half of the 1940 level, and flour was essential to bread. Bread was essential to the diet. It was a mainstay. So cutting the flour by half of the 1940 level meant that people were hungry. The state now immediately moved because it realized that central state stocks alone could not feed the population. They were not going to be adequate. So 5 sources of food were now consciously developed by the state. And these were, first, central state stocks, which I've already talked a little bit about. Those were the stocks of food that were distributed through the Commissariat of Trade to every city, to every industrial center, and in some cases directly to the defense plants. Second, they instituted a policy of subsidiary farms. Every factory, mine, and mill now began farming. Huge plots of land that were not either inhabited or already farmed were attached to the factories, and the factories now went into the business of creating piggeries, raising pigs based on the swill from the dining halls. They went into the business of planting potatoes, raising chickens, doing whatever it was they could to supplement the food that was given out to the workers in the dining halls. Second, the factories were given the opportunity now to purchase food for the factory, for their workers, on a decentralized basis. So they began contracting separately now with fisheries, dairies, collective farms, state farms, any food producer in the region. They began setting up separate independent contracts to be able to get some food from those other enterprises. An enormous gardening movement was launched. There were collective gardens. There were individual gardens. Everybody in the country began planting potatoes. And that homely potato, I would say, kept the population from dying of starvation. Everybody was planting potatoes, and Potato is relatively easy crop to grow. It requires very little weeding, and people began supplementing the bread ration with a lot of potatoes. And then finally, the fifth source of food for people was collective farm markets. Peasants were allowed to sell for whatever price the food would bring. So that was free market prices. This is the only source, only place in the country where you have free market prices. Everything else was subsidized. Over and above what they produced for the state, peasants began marketing food in the kolkhoz, or the collective farm markets. Now, the price of food in these markets was absolutely out of sight. People could not afford to eat on what they bought from the collective farm markets, but they could use the markets to supplement the food that they were already receiving from other sources. So one question that comes up is, how much food did each of these sources contribute to people's survival? How important was each source? All right, by 1944, state central stocks provided 68% of all calories consumed by the urban population. So they're critical. The subsidiary farms, about 4.5%. The decentralized purchasing or contracts, 0.8%, very small. Collective and personal gardens, 12.4%. And the collective farm markets, where you have the free market prices, 14.5%. So what are we seeing here in essence? State central stocks are providing more than 2/3 of the total calories consumed. And the collective farm markets, the place where we have the free market prices, provided a little more than 1/8 of the calories consumed. In other words, the state was providing the overwhelming number of calories consumed, and other sources were absolutely critical in terms of supplementing this diet with some meat, some milk, some eggs, some additional sources of food. Well, I've sketched for you now the rough policy. So the question is, well, there's a big difference between what a policy looks like on paper and what it actually looks like in practice. So how did these policies function in practice? In other words, what was it like to actually be a Soviet worker in the time of World War II? Well, first of all, state policy, no matter how efficient, could not compensate for the loss of prime farmland, animals, and machinery. Central stocks could not cover the vast needs of the mobilized workers and people who were evacuated, who went to the industrial towns. By 1942, workers were hungry, they were malnourished, and a number of them were starving. There were many starvation deaths among workers in the Soviet Union during the war. The situation reached the lowest point in terms of consumption in 1942. And at that point, people were consuming about 75% of the pre-war calories, and even in the pre-war period, people had not been eating well. I suspect if all of us were consuming 75% of what we're consuming now, we would not be doing badly, but this was, of course, a very different situation. Free market prices were basically out of reach, and moreover, peasants were increasingly interested in barter. There were no goods being produced in the Soviet Union during the war for consumption. There were no consumer goods. You could not buy clothes, shoes. You could not buy a needle and a thread to mend anything. You could not buy a pot, a pan, a tea kettle, nothing. A new winter coat, nothing. So peasants could get rubles, but they couldn't buy anything with it. So increasingly, when workers or white-collar people, teachers, professors, scientists would come to the market, peasants didn't want rubles. They wanted jewelry, clothing, shoes, usable items. And so that was also an important trend. Another trend, retail state stores began to close. So now, even if you had a ration card to walk into a store and you were entitled to, let's say, 2 pounds of potatoes, increasingly there were no stores to walk into. People were being fed at work. People began eating in the dining halls, or the stolovayas as they're known, at work. And more, that's where people began getting often their only meal of the day. In addition, millions of people had been mobilized for work. So young people were mobilized and sent off to factories, to mines. Women were mobilized en masse. Everybody was working. And people were frequently working in places that they were not from. So they were shipped off, millions of people, to work in plants and factories where the factory administration was then responsible for providing housing. Yet, there were no materials available for building. Cement, wood, nails, glass, all of these things were worth their weight in gold. All production was being oriented toward defense. So people lived in hastily constructed barracks. There was no running water. There were no toilet facilities. There was no heat. People lived in places where the temperature plunged to 45 degrees below zero without heat. There was a fuel shortage. There was no fuel to heat the homes or the barracks. People also lived in earthen dugouts. They would dig down 2 or 3 feet into the ground and then build a little structure over that so that you could stand up inside it, and that's where workers slept. In many cases, workers slept in the shops. They slept by the machines. In these situations, people had no access to kitchens. And that seems obvious, but I think it's something we don't often really think through. They had no access to kitchens, they had no access to stoves, often they had no access to running water. So they ate in factory dining halls. And the factory dining halls became a crucial source of food, not only for workers, but in many cities around the country and in towns, other groups as well would be brought in there to eat. So, for example, evacuees would be brought in to the factory to eat alongside the workers. Municipal officials, teachers, medical personnel, children, hungry families, all of these people could be found in the dining halls eating side by side with the workers. Unfortunately, there were no extra allocations of food for these extra eaters. And so the vast cauldrons were simply watered down. The caloric content of the soup or whatever people were being fed was reduced, and hunger in that way was distributed among many. The dining halls also faced massive organizational problems. So whereas a factory might have fed before the war 1,000 workers, it was now responsible for feeding 20,000 workers. And yet it had to do this with the same utensils, forks, knives, plates, seats, tables that it had used before. These things were not being produced during the war. So we have a situation where there were massive lines to get into the dining halls. Workers would eat in shifts. The plates and dishes would be washed numerous times, over and over again, or barely washed at all. There were terrible problems with illness as a result of conditions in the dining halls. There was often no hot water to clean the utensils. Stomach illnesses were endemic and very, very common. So these were all problems. I would say at worst, workers did heavy labor on bread and a single bowl of gruel made from hot water, and it had some flour. The unions became very active in the collective and individual gardening movement. They passed out seed, they passed out plots, they organized planting. So there was a real kind of mass movement here to begin supplementing food. Also, factory directors contracted with fisheries and other sources, and those two, although it was only a tiny percentage for the population overall, it did help in the factories and the defense plants. And then finally, this is a sort of interesting sub-story to all of this. The state began experimenting with all sorts of additional food sources that we don't normally think of. But I want to share these with you because I hope you never go hungry. But if you do, you actually might find some of this useful. First of all, nettles. Krapiva in Russian. Nettles, which grow like a weed all over the place. It's that plant that when you pluck it, you get tiny little needles throughout your hands. That can be boiled, and it can be eaten, and it actually is nutritious. Second, if you are boiling potatoes, the water that you've boiled them in is filled with starch. If you boil that down and you flavor it with a little bit of sugar, you will get what's served as dessert in the Soviet dining halls during the war. Third, I've noticed that you have a number of evergreens in this area. If you boil evergreens, you get a horrible, foul-tasting liquid, which the Russians called kvoy. It is filled with vitamin C. And while it is horrible to drink, it is a wonderful counteractor to scurvy. So that too. And then finally, something I never knew about, the state began growing yeast, which evidently is very easy to grow, and they were growing it by the ton. Tons and tons of yeast. This stuff tastes disgusting, but it's a very good source of protein. And they were actually running culinary schools, very different from Iron Chef and gourmet cooking and all the stuff we see on TV today. They were running culinary schools for the cooks in the factory dining halls to teach them how to use all of these sources of food and how to add these tons of yeast to the pot of cabbage soup in order to give it some protein without making it too disgusting to actually force down. So this too was a kind of interesting story of food during the war. So how important was the state to the production, distribution, and allocation of food? Well, I would say at every level and in almost every initiative, the state played a critical role. This is an example of where state guidance and control proved really important. It allowed the home front to survive, to function, and ultimately, and most importantly, to outproduce the Nazis. The state drew directly on its organizations and the planning that it had pioneered in the 1930s in the period of industrialization. And actually, despite terrible shortage, malnutrition, and even starvation, state policies helped to maintain stability and to distribute food in an organized manner. The policy of combining central state stocks with local supplementation was very effective. That combination of centralized and decentralized efforts actually proved to be an enormously effective strategy in terms of feeding the population. I'd like to end tonight with some comments about the nature of the Soviet victory. The nature of the victory has really been debated widely by historians. How was it possible that the Soviet Union was able to triumph over the Nazis in these conditions? Now, many historians now suggest that the victory over fascism belongs to the Soviet people. And according to this view, people united, sort of spontaneously and independently, to drive out the invader. They triumphed not because of the state, but in spite of the state. And I would say that's probably the most common view now among American historians. The state, however, is not some abstraction. If we're going to study the role of the state, we actually have to study its specific embodiment in organizations. So, for example, we have to study the Communist Party, the unions, the Soviets, the Commissariat of Trade, and other organizations. It's these organizations that embody this abstraction that we call the state. Once we look at these organizations and what they were actually doing on the national, provincial, republic, and local levels, we see that they were essential to provisioning. The efforts of the people, both collectively and individually, cannot be divorced from those of the state. In the Soviet Union during the war, the history of food is not the struggle of lone individuals to forage, to pillage, or to secure their own bunkers. It's not this survivalist mentality, I think now, that exists in certain areas of the United States. But rather, it's a history of people who were able to channel their energies into powerful, well-structured state institutions which had a great store of experience in central planning, popular mobilization, and collective organization. At no time were workers abandoned by the state to a free market in which the most aggressive profiteers could triumph over the most vulnerable. Without the labor of working people, these state initiatives would have been nothing but empty phrases. In this sense, the energies, the desires, and the needs of the people are enormously important. But without an organizational framework that was provided by the state, the people would not have been able to channel their desire for victory so effectively. And I think that it's this combination that is the key to one of the greatest victories of the 20th century. Questions?
We have about 10-15 minutes for questions, and then we'll go to book signing. Yes, sir?
Professor, it seems as if most Russian historians post-Soviet era have come to the conclusion that Lend-Lease was much more an important factor in the victory of the Stalinist state. They've even done caloric intake, in terms of food stuff provided by America, for instance. Have you possibly read Professor Week's study of Lend-Lease?
I have not read that study, no. I know Lend-Lease was very important in terms of providing trucks. It provided some tanks, and I know that it also provided food. I think a lot of that food ended up on the frontline areas. It was sent to the Red Army. So I'm not sure what percentage, how much, let's say, could we figure out caloric consumption on the home front was actually the result of Lend-Lease. Do you know that?
Well, I think Sokolov said that caloric intake would have supported a 10 million man army for, I think, 1,377 days, the entire length of the war.
So,
Just wanted to...
yeah, no, that's a very important point.
Hello. What would be your take on Rosa Luxemburg and Kropotkin, and later on Leon Trotsky's criticisms of Stalinist authoritarianism within Soviet Russia?
Well, I would say that those criticisms are extremely valuable and essentially true. So I've not meant tonight to give, let's say, a defense of an authoritarian state. What I have meant to say, though, is that it's a kind of corrective, I guess, to this view that the state was unimportant and that it was all the result of just people. I think in this case, we can really see the state channeling some very important lessons in terms of distribution and planning and organizing things. So, for example, I was talking with some of my colleagues here over dinner about the whole issue, for example, about disaster relief and what happened with Katrina and also Hurricane Sandy. So one way to think about the war is you can think of it as a massive hurricane that basically lasts for 5 years. Now, we know that we don't have to be in favor of an authoritarian state to understand that state initiatives are enormously important in times when people are faced with massive disaster and loss. So I would say more, the talk is not in defense of Stalinism, it's not in defense of authoritarianism or anything like that. It's just against this notion that individuals do it all as individuals, which I think is a pretty popular message in the United States, and that the state really should not have a role or doesn't have a role. This is an example where I really feel as if the state hadn't had a role, I think the Nazis would have won, despite Lend-Lease.
There's a question down here.
Hi. So this is just kind of a simple question. You had said that Soviet archives have been closed until the early 90s, and so there wasn't really a lot of, there's information that's kind of newly available. So I'm wondering, what is it like to research
Well, I have done research actually under Soviet conditions and under post-Soviet conditions. When I first went to the Soviet Union, and I was there 1984 to 1985, the foreigners worked in a separate reading room. We were not even allowed to work side by side with our Soviet colleagues. So we were placed in a separate area within the archive. And then you wrote out your topic, and you handed it to the archivist, and the archivist brought you what they thought you needed. So you had no idea what the archive held, and we were not allowed to see what was called the OPC, which is the list of what the archive holds. We couldn't see that. Now, the OPC are available, and you can go through, you can order basically what it is you want among the archive holdings. As a matter of fact, a lot of what I've shared with you tonight is from a fund or a section within the archive that previously it was a secret fund of the unions, and we were never even allowed. You never saw any of the OPC, but this was actually hidden even from the OPC. And I had a wonderful experience in the early 1990s. At that time, I was working on Women at the Gates, and I had been working in GARF, the State Archive, day after day. It was enormously hot. I was actually working outside of the main reading room in a little Kranilishi kind of area, and they would bring me the documents. And I had ordered a bunch of things. And one morning I went in there and I sat down, and there was this folder on top of my folders, which I hadn't ordered. And I opened it up, and I was just in shock. It was from the Secret Union Fund, and it had all of the reports of workers' moods and negative comments and protests that had previously been hidden from us. So I look around, I can't figure out, what is this thing? I didn't order it. How did I get it? And I turned to the archivist, who was an old man who was helping me. He had actually lived through the war and had seen the burning of many of the documents during the war in Moscow. And I asked him, I said, this is wonderful. Where is this from? Is there anything, this is just exactly what I've been looking for. And he said to me, would you like to see more like this? And I said, oh, yes. And I have to say, he's dead now. But no, he died of, I was very sad. I went to the archives and I asked for him, and I found out he had died. He was very brave. That was a period, it wasn't exactly clear whether they should be handing over stuff or not. And he gave it to me. And he gave it to me at a time, you know, it takes a lot of courage to do that. Later, there was, of course, nothing to it. You just ordered it. But at that time, he did something. I'll always remember him for that.
Do you think, given what Hitler was dying for, the decision to invade Russia was a good one? I mean, obviously, 2020 hindsight, but at the time, they did the right thing by going to Russia.
Did the Nazis do the right thing?
Yeah, do you think that decision to invade Russia, I've always read it was a bad decision, but it sounds like what you're saying, in theory, it's probably a pretty good idea at the time.
Well, Baca certainly thought so. He thought, you know, if we starve 100 million people to death, we can fight this war for a long time. So I guess from a fascist point of view, or from an eliminationist point of view, Baca had a point.
Sure, we're not going to end on that down note.
What was your analysis of Reed's book on Leningrad? Have you read it?
No, I haven't. Is this about the siege?
This is
No, I haven't read it. Actually, I need to read it. I would say the project is just beginning, and there's a lot of material that I have not read. I have a collaborator on this project. We have left Leningrad actually out of our study. It's a kind of special case. It's received a lot of attention. Richard Bidlock also wrote quite a bit on workers in Leningrad. So as an encircled city, it's a kind of special instance. So in that sense, we've sort of made the decision not to touch Leningrad and to sort of let that be a separate part. But I certainly want to look at Anna Reid's book.